You want me to go?
Go for it.
Sure. So I hated poetry when I was in high school, and so I don't think I memorized anything until college. I had several poetry teachers that thought poetry was more of a bludgeon than anything else, and a bludgeon through which they would inflict their understanding upon me. And it made me not want to take those words inside. It made me very resistant to poetry, to literature in general. And luckily, I had some teachers a little bit longer along in my education that opened up language to me. Teachers of poetry, teachers of fiction, opened up language to me. And I think that at that point, I decided I wanted to carry some of that language around with me. Are you Miss Rosa Caulfield? You better come on out, Jan. A last sentence from a William Faulkner book. And pardon the bad Quentin Compson accent if you're a Faulkner fan. Or, just snippets from poetry. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. William Butler Yeats' apocalyptic poem, that is one of the most frightening ones of the 20th century. So I started getting these snippets when I had undergraduate teachers that were really exciting for me. And the first poem that I memorized, oh Lord, I shouldn't say that because I'll be answerable for sharing it, and I don't know if I can. I used to want to memorize a poem every couple of weeks, and now I hope to remember at least one or two poems every couple of weeks. But it was Jack Gilbert's poem, Rain, and it was a lovely small lyrical poem that I thought beautiful.
Yeah, I think I've loved poetry for as long as I can remember, but it's taken many different forms. My earliest memories of recitation are probably in far sillier and more trivial things than poetry. I have a lot of memories of annoying my friends with songs and movies that I had watched so many times that they kind of existed in my head. And I think it was like a really wonderful form of entertainment to be able to like pull out these words that had been humorous to me or heartbreaking or fun, and entertaining and be able to kind of like they existed within me and I didn't need some external way of saying them. I remember my older sister took part in Poetry Out Loud when she was in high school. And in the process of her wandering around our kitchen trying to memorize a poem, I remember it's called The Obligation to Be Happy. I don't remember the author's name, but I memorized it along with her through. Maybe I was trying to, but I swear I wasn't. And I could, we could practice it together. And I still think it's probably the poem I know best. Some of the ones I've memorized for my own competitions have come and gone, but I feel like I guess just finding words in any variety, whether it's a song or a script or a line in a poem or a book that I really loved and would just reread, it kind of felt like it just naturally stuck with me, and I always had so much fun. Even now, like when I'm on a run or something, I love that there's like a wealth of words in my head that I enjoy coming back to. So it was always just kind of like entertainment, almost self-driven entertainment.
That's really well put, and it's fantastic that your sister's work with poetry started to inhabit your verbal landscape. Um,
Mhm.
it sends me back to all those things that kind of intrude upon our verbal landscape, and I would ask if there's anyone listening who couldn't recite a commercial jingle, or a theme song for an absolutely insipid TV show. And I guess that I could be wrong. Please, throw in the chat box you're an idiot and you're wrong. But I guess that almost all of us carry that around. And it's so beautiful that your sister handed off words that mattered to her and you got to carry them too.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it can be really special and you don't even almost notice that it's happening. There's a lot of ski trails in the Methow Valley, and there's these benches that have, if my dad's on, he'll know, but they have lines from songs or poems carved into them. And I would always remember skiing by them and trying to like come up with the rest of the words in my head. And yeah, I've always just really enjoyed like finding where words can fit into my life in random ways and like not always necessarily when you just sit down to read them, but they can just kind of be all around you.
Yeah. I think they're William Stafford lines.
There's one, there's a Joni Mitchell lyric on one. Um, yeah, and there's one about a crow. I haven't been home in a while. I need to go back.
Time to go skiing again.
I know.
One question I have for two of you, and this would be interesting with one professor here and one student, what you see as kind of the key ways that poetry connects to learning.
Mm. Poetry in general or the memorization of poetry or
It
both?
did, yeah, both.
Um, well, I teach many courses that are general education courses, so they're not aimed at English majors. And bridging back to what I said earlier, I think that my dream, my sole intention in some ways, that for which that to which I dedicate myself completely, is trying to have the students come away from those classes with maybe not an incredibly deep knowledge of the biography of William Butler Yeats or some specific tidbit about Edna St. Vincent Millay, but some words from the course that really spoke to them that maybe 10 years down the line, they'll think back and say, man, that J. Alfred Prufrock was messed up. He couldn't make a decision about anything. Or red wheelbarrows are pretty cool. And I wouldn't have noticed this one if I hadn't been looking carefully at the world. So, as a teacher in a literature course, that's what I hope for. I think that in terms of one's education generally, the careful attention that literature demands and that writing demands is something that carries over to all the courses of study. If you can read a poem and live with it for a long while and make sure that you're comfortable with all the diction in it and make sure that you have a sense of maybe what the poem adds up to, feel the rhythms of the poem, then I think some of those methods, some of those modes of encountering language will help you in whatever class where you're reading a text. And so I hope that my business majors and my biology majors carry that attention away from my class.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very true that poetry, in reading and analyzing it, especially some of the older poems that language has changed a lot. I think it presents a unique challenge, and it's kind of an endurance sport in that you're not going to understand a poem necessarily the first time that you read it. I, in my own school experience, initially didn't love I think I always really enjoyed reading and working with poetry. I did a project my freshman year on Margaret Atwood's poetry and really enjoyed that. Um, but I didn't always love having to write poetry for classes because sometimes it felt like you can't force it. And I think in that way, poetry is writing it has been much more of like a personal learning for me than a rigid or formal academic one. And so I think that's why I feel really passionate that everyone, whether you're whatever you find yourself interested in or think are your capabilities in terms of being a writer, writing poetry is so much more about learning about yourself. And I think what's so cool about poetry out loud is it kind of bridges those two worlds and a lot of times feels safer to bring a poem and share it when it's not your own. So there's really important self realizations and learnings that can happen. And then also, yeah, I think you just it forces you to slow down a little bit and spend spend time and try to inhabit the headspace of the writer to read someone else's work, which is sometimes can be a challenge, but also can be really fun. There's poems that in my literature class last year we would read, 4 or 5 times and just like almost frustratedly try to figure out, and then you come away with that with a much bigger understanding of than just the poem.
It's funny that you mentioned Margaret Atwood. Flashing back, I think Margaret Atwood, one of her poems might have been the second poem that I memorized, and it's kind of a brutal relationship poem. Um, it you fit into me like a hook into an eye, a
Mhm.
fish hook, an open eye. Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
Then the other thing that came to mind for me is how absolutely terrified many of my students are, if not nearly all of them, about memorizing and reciting a poem in front of peers. There's this strange, well, strange is the wrong word, but there's this really, really intense anxiety that people have about getting, a word or two wrong, or just wait, I have to start over again. I can't memorize. And oh my gosh, that it's not the case at all. It's lovely that you shared some words, and let's start over again and hear those words again. And I think that makes it encouraging. That understanding makes it so much more of a celebration rather than a let's see if you get the extra credit points.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the accuracy is impressive, but it's not, I think, what makes the recitation impactful for sure. I think even now I've gone up and recited poems a lot of times, and I still probably am shaking just as much as I was the first time because it is terrifying. But it's also, um, I think poetry out loud is really the only thing I've done like up on stages since I was a kid and wasn't afraid of that and was fine doing plays and whatever. And so it's been really, I think I haven't even necessarily understood why I still wanted to, even though I did find it so terrifying. But that reward and kind of the feeling of like I have something to share and it's someone else's to some extent, so I'm just a vessel, but also I have something within my head that I now get to share, which is so it feels like a surprise, which I always thought was kind of fun and it made it less terrifying.
Yeah. That talking about carrying someone else's work that, like you said, made me revisit in my head that anxiety. It's almost when we're reciting a poem, we also sense a duty uh,
Hmm.
to the maker to somehow honor that making, and so maybe that increases the pressure. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Especially if the poem feels like it has a certain weight to it, which many of the most beautiful ones do. Um, and it's so clear that it was written with a lot of emotion and feeling. It's actually really interesting to think about like if some of these poets, I mean, some are modern, but some are not, would have any idea that, 15 and 16-year-old kids from all over the country would be reciting the words, and hopefully they would be delighted by that. But there's certainly a level of these words are not, you want to make them your own, but they're also come from someone else's experience, which I think is really beautiful.
Like there was something you mentioned earlier about your experience writing poetry as kind of a path of self-discovery. And I'm just kind of curious to ask if how you feel poetry out loud has any kind of role to play in self-discovery as well, and your experience learning more about yourself by selecting a poem and doing recitation and anything
Yeah,
along those lines.
I think, I mean, in one way, which is kind of simple, but spending a lot of time with the poems I chose for Poetry Out Loud made me want to write more. And I think those two have always been really connected, and that's why it was so fun to participate in poetry ourselves. Um, but I also think that, and there is also the component of working to a point of being comfortable, getting up and sharing, whether that's with my peers or with students from all over Washington, who I don't know at first. I think you learn a lot about yourself. I,
Mm.
yeah, I think it's not as, I would say it's not as directly correlated to like self-discovery as my own writing has been, to inhabit someone else's words. But I've often found that when I'm looking through the catalog and in those initial first weeks of trying to find the poems that you're drawn to say a lot about who you are and where you're at the time. And like looking back now, I don't remember all of my poems, unfortunately. That would be very, very cool. But they kind of feel like a little snapshot of where I was at the time. And for some reason, that poem spoke to me in ninth and 10th and 11th and 12th grade. And so I think, yeah, the art that we like connect with and are drawn to in a lot of ways revealing in the same way that the art that we make is.
One thing that comes to mind in that arena is I think that the more one reads, of course, the more one is able to write because you're taking those words inside. But I think that the reading of poetry can sometimes startle us into new awareness of who we are. I was sharing Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Fish, today, and I've read that poem God knows how many times. It's a poem I often discuss in class. And the end of it is glorious, and the end of it is so that's this transcendent moment that the speaker feels, and it repeats the word rainbow, rainbow, rainbow 3 times. And I found myself hitching a little bit, choking up a little bit because there was something so glorious that I've experienced so many times reading that poem. But in this moment in my life, it hit me again. And it's spectacular that poetry will do that. And when it does, it teaches you something about where you are right now that
Hmm.
you didn't sense earlier in your
Yeah,
life.
that's what I feel so strongly about is that poetry and art is just like so grounding in the current moment. I was in kind of revisiting my poetry out loud experience for this. I was looking back at the poems that I most recently recited, and one of them is called The Greatest Grandeur by Patty Ann Rogers. And it talks about, throws out a bunch of different ideas about what is like the greatest thing on planet Earth, I guess, and like the greatest feeling. And then at the end, it basically says the greatest thing is this empty void that we fill with all of these ideas of what is the greatest thing. And the best thing about it is that it's never fully filled, never is the last line. And I was thinking about when I recited that at State, it was the spring of my senior year, and I didn't really know what I was doing next, and I still honestly don't. But I think there was a lot of pressure and confusion about what what this next big thing and like how to see this whole world and narrow it down to some extent. And that poem says, no, it's all part of it, and all of the new experiences together are what is going to be special. And so, yeah, it is really cool to reflect and see how maybe I didn't think at the time that I was choosing it for that reason, but it now it like that period of my life and that poem are kind of welded together.
So, I mean, on this same kind of theme, I'm curious to hear from both of you to like kind of reflect on your very first encounters with poetry and where you sit with it now and what that change, what that evolution has been like and what's been surprising along the way.
Um, Yeah, I don't know if I can pinpoint my first encounters with poetry. Um, I I know I really started writing more poetry during all of the ample time that I spent in my bedroom during COVID. And before that, I think it had been more of a like never a very like dedicated process. Um, but now it's become one of my most important creative outlets. And I find that, I mean, poetry, I guess I wouldn't always say I'm writing poems, but I think it all takes a relatively similar form. Is like the best way I know to process whatever is currently happening in my life and whatever I'm currently feeling. And so I think yeah, I've developed a lot of a closer relationship with poetry as I've gotten older. And the same goes for reading. There's poets now that I feel like are I hold so dear to my heart and have kind of been with me for a long time. Um, I think yeah, it's definitely a very personal aspect of my life, but it's also something that I gain a lot of joy from sharing, and poetry out loud is one of those ways, or um, sometimes I feel like I can only express what is I'm really feeling in poems, and sometimes being able to share those is like so cathartic and special. So yeah, I don't know if I have like the exact words for when it began, but it's definitely evolved into something that I credit a lot of my stability and sanity to.
March 6th, 1984, be the date. Van Halen had just released a new album, and I was sitting in Mr. Hebert's English class talking about stopping by woods on a snowy evening, as I mentioned earlier, and just being embarrassed in front of the class because I didn't think it was a Christmas card poem. I thought there was something kind of creepy about it. And being told, no, no, you don't understand the poem. And as I said, that drove me away from poetry. So that first encounter, poetry with a capital P. I suppose there are many, many forms of poetic language that inhabit us in ways that are beautiful and wonderful before we get to that literature with a capital L and poetry with a capital P moment. But I recovered from that and have returned to that poem many times and carry that poem around with me. And I think that moving away from that first really negative experience took a long while. I decided not to study literature in college. I was going to be a philosophy major because that's what people who like Van Halen and Bob Marley and others study. Philosophy got cast by the wayside. Poetry took things back up, and now that poem is one that I find kind of terrifying, and I'd love to go back, though this is probably kind of a wrong thing to say, but go back and tell Mr. Hebert, he's long dead, that come on, listen to this high school student a little bit, and maybe the poem will be reopened for you.
Thank you for sharing that, both of you. So now, and I want to tell the room, we want to hear from you. We're going to have a little time for question and answer at the end, so you can start thinking now. I've got a couple more questions for our speakers. So when the time comes when we get to Q&A, you can raise your hand or type your question in chat and we'll read it aloud to the group. So for students who are here on this call or people who work with young people, what advice do both of you have for those who are looking to improve their public performance of poetry? Being on stage, being in front of a group, a crowd, your peers, strangers. What techniques, what strategies might help?
I'm kind of terrible at it, and so I'll speak first. If I were in Poetry Out Loud, I would have just bombed the whole competition. And I think the reasons that I'm terrible at it is because I tend to move in kind of erratic ways and sway back and forth and kind of look off, and so I don't have that, I think, focused intensity that Poetry Out Loud competitors have, and it's just riveting how those performances unfold and the passion in those performances, which isn't to say that I don't feel passionate about it. I just, I'm kind of goofy in that way. And I think that probably I wouldn't be very helpful, but I can, in terms of a model, but I can certainly see when someone has given themselves to a poem and taken it inside and worked with it and shared it with others over and over again, that there's a really intense relationship with that language that I admire. And so don't do what I do. Do what the pros do. So
I don't know about that. I think a goofy telling can sometimes be just as impactful as a very serious one. But um, I mean, I would say like strategy wise, I think especially if you're like me and you're not super comfortable on stage, the best thing you can do for yourself is as much as you can to remove that fear by just like knowing it like the back of your hand. And that means I think that poem just kind of lives with you and lives in your house for a while. And when I am trying to make sure that every single word, I know exactly where it falls, I'll be running or doing my whatever tasks and just running through it again and again. Because I think if you know the words, then you can move on to this, like, okay, now how do I share this knowledge in the best way? Um, I think it's so much about the poems that you choose. And there's no real science to selecting poems, but I find that I really need them to be it's sharing a message that I want to share because I think you can feel that maybe it is kind of an intensity, but you can feel that there's a lot of care and that you kind of now you have digested this message and somehow been changed by it, and I get to present that to an audience. And I think it all ties together because that probably says something about what the student is feeling and dealing with at the time. So just yeah, I guess open yourself up to like really inhabiting the same space as the poem for as long a period of time as you can, and then make sure that you understand what's special about it that you want to translate. I don't think it has to be some grand theatrical showing. And I've struggled with like my coaches would always tell me I need to enunciate with my hands more and be more alive, and that was always hard for me. But I always felt like the words themselves, if I really knew what I wanted, why I wanted to say them, I felt a lot more confident in saying them, I guess.
Yeah, this notion of knowing why you want to say them and selecting a poem. So do you have any advice or just reflections on when you were going through the Poetry Out Loud database? And for those who may not know, Poetry Out Loud has a database of, well, Alexis, is it thousands? How many poems?
It's about 1100.
1,100.
It's called the anthology. I'll put just a link in the chat. Folks, feel free to check it out after the meeting. But
Yeah.
and cool search tools on it too, and a random feature. So if you just want a random poem, it'll give you that.
That's what I always did. I think all of my poems have been found through the random generator. I would say maybe this isn't great advice if there's teachers, but don't let your teacher sell you on a poem necessarily. I mean, give it a chance, listen to it, but if the only reason you're choosing it is because your teacher or someone else really loves it, you're probably going to not enjoy having it inhabit your headspace for a really long time. Um, I would read a ton and save the ones that I found myself wanting to read again, and then slowly narrow it down. And I feel like, yeah, you kind of, I mean, there's lots of things about length and how the kind of language you want to share, feel comfortable sharing, but I often feel like I would just read a poem that I was like, I almost wish I wrote, to some extent because it said something that it just struck me or that was similar to something that I'd been trying to get out, or something I needed to hear. And I felt like that just called me to a poem. So that's not very concrete advice, but I guess read read as many as you can and then try to find the ones that make you feel something and make you want to return to them, and maybe have something in them that's like a little bit confusing and challenging that you get to puzzle through and work out, or a line that's unexpected. I One of the poems I recited ended with the word blackberry 3 times, and that really caught me. I was like, that's kind of a weird choice. But then I came to really love it, and I was excited because nobody knew that I was going to get up on stage and yell BlackBerry at them, but that was fun. So yeah, trust your gut, I guess.
What was the title of that poem? Just out of
It's
curiosity.
called Meditation at Lagunitas.
All the
Um,
new thinking is about loss.
yes, in this it resembles all the old thinking. I was just recalling that poem, and it's like halfway still in my head. Um, yeah, I that's the first one I found, and I was like, I'm gonna do this one, and then I'll find a different one to go with it. But I I think I had been like that first line struck me. I'd been kind of thinking about the idea of loss and feeling that, and it was like this is the poem that I want to say. It's a beautiful one, so everyone should go read it.
All the new thinking is about loss, and this it resembles all the old thinking. The idea, for example, like
Look at you.
that's one that I had
And
in my
something
pocket.
about, yeah, a woodpecker
The woodpecker, and
probing the dead sculpted trunk.
that black birch.
Yeah.
A word is elegy to what it signifies,
Yes.
but we can't quite get it.
No, I
All the new
know.
thinking is about loss, and this it resembles all the old thinking. The idea, for example,
I think it's
each
that
particular
each
erases
particular, the
erases
luminous
this
clarity of a
clarity of a
general
general
idea.
idea.
Or
Or
the
the
other
other
notion.
notion that because there is one thing,
You guys should add a poetry out loud category where you can go back and forth.
that's a favorite poem, fantastic poem.
Yeah.
I will note that, Lecky. Thank you. It's like it's the game show part of the
Yeah,
the
exactly.
competition.
It's like improv. almost. Might have to get rid of the accuracy department for that, but
We'll just scrap the judging criteria and start from scratch.
sounds good. Sounds good.
This was one on my list of questions for you guys, but I'm just curious. I mean, maybe this is mostly for Leki, but just what kind of community forms as being part of Poetry Out Loud? You know, what kind of relationships you had with the participants in your region and the finalists? And Todd, anything that you can speak to it too, I'd just be curious to hear.
Yeah, that's one of the coolest things about Poetry Out Loud. Within my school, we would all be required most or some years to memorize poems in our classroom and recite. And then I found that of my like immediate peer group, I was kind of the only one that wanted to do it when it wasn't required for school. And so it pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit socially. Um, and that was always really fun. And then I was very struck going to state this year because my freshman year state was we submitted video recordings and it was like played on a Zoom. Um, but I was able to go in person and we spent the whole day together and kind of got to know each other and played around on the set of the musical that was there and I was very struck by how diverse of a group of kids it was. Everyone had a different interest and we're all from Washington but come from totally different places. And I think that was so cool for me to see that so many different kids are brought to Poetry Out Loud and we can connect. I remember there was one year at the regional competition, a girl and I were wearing the same kind of shoes and we still like text sometimes and like check in and see how each other doing. So I think it's a very like shared experience where you don't have to have all that much in common, but you have the fact that you are terrified to get up on stage and have these poems in your head in common, and then it becomes this really sweet and kind of impromptu community, which I think is so special.
That's great. Thank you, Leki. Thank you, Leki and Todd. We're going to open it up for Q&A now. We want to hear from you and what questions you have for Leki and Todd about Poetry Out Loud or poetry in general. Or did we cover all the bases? Again, to ask a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that, you can probably go ahead and unmute and ask, or you can drop your question into chat.
We talked about it late last night, and I thought I detected in the voice of my friend a thin wire of grief.
Tone almost querulous. Yeah. My favorite line in that poem actually is, "But I remember so much."
Yeah.
I think that's the line that drew me to the poem.
The way her hands dismantled bread, the
Mhm.
thing her father said that hurt her,
What she
what she
dreamed.
dreamed. Yeah.
This is impressive because you didn't have to memorize it.
Oh, yeah, I try to carry a few of them with me.
All right, we have a question in the chat from Sarah. She says, thank you for being here. I have a question for both poets. Can you share insight on how you or how you've seen poets translate visual elements of a poem, especially unconventional formatting, scattered words, white space, indentations, etc., into spoken performance or recitation?
That's a good question. I think, well, to be honest, I've maybe made some safe choices and I haven't recited any really unconventionally formatted poems. Um, but I think it's really about the time you spend with the poem again. And it sometimes is more of like a decoding process. If the artist has or the poet has presented it in kind of a unique way. I think you have to determine how much of that is meant to be on the page and how much of it breaks up and changes how what the words themselves mean. Um, I've had some interesting questions with that. Like I did a poem once that began with a quote by someone else and then went into the poem, and so that was kind of interesting to figure out how to make those two voices kind of different. Or actually, gosh, I forget what it was called, but I did one poem that it was formatted interestingly, and as I slowly worked with the poem more, I realized there was kind of a conversation going on within the poem itself in two different voices, and I had to to figure out how to embody those two different things and make that clear, because I think it's important to remember that most of the people in the audience haven't read the poem that you're saying. And so it's really your job to kind of be a translator to some extent. And that can only happen if you really understand. And there's many different ways probably to interpret every poem. And so you don't have to get it perfectly right, but it's whatever feels like, whatever you see as the interpretation, and then just figuring out how to, I guess that's not really an answer, but work with it more, I guess, and consult with other people. My coaches were always really helpful with that, because different eyes and voices will interpret things differently.
Now, I'm curious, I don't know the canon of the Poetry Out Loud select the poems you can choose from. I suspect that it's really difficult to to convey some of those visual aspects in reciting a poem. We had Quentin Baker to campus a few weeks ago, and I thought they were spectacular in communicating their erasure poems. And I think that one of the ways that they were so successful is that they allowed for silence to play a really significant part in their sharing of the words. I know that when I recite poems, I often get in this mode of I better hurry through it or I'm going to forget something and mess up. If I keep my momentum going, then I'll be able to get the poem out correctly. Quentin did an amazing job with allowing the white space to fill the room in a really compelling way. And so I can speak to that dynamic of white space, indentation, and some of the other aspects of the question. I think present challenges that I don't feel I could talk about.
Good
Yeah, that
advice.
is stuff.
Other questions from the room?
A word is elegy to what it signifies is a line in that poem. Robert Hass has some pretty amazing pieces. He has a prose poem called A Story About the Body that one might check out.
I think there might be another one of his poems on the Poetry Out Loud database, because I remember just loving his language and wanting to see more of it. Yeah, there's something about the my childhood river with its island willows.
The going
This
back to
little fish called pumpkin seed.
pumpkin seed. Going back to the students in the general ed class, I think nearly all of them carry away Basho's Old Stone Pond, Frog Jumps, Splash, because we talk about it the first day of class. I say, here's one poem you can put in your pocket, probably one of the most well-known poems in the world. And then last day of class, 3, 2, 1, right? Old Stone Pond, Frog Jump, Splash. And many of them have it, and they might think, okay, why? But it's a poem that is about presence and absence. And maybe they'll think about that somewhere down the line.
We do have time for about one more question. I have one if there. Oh, here we go. From Marianne. Were you exposed to poetry early and required to memorize poems? She says, I was, and it made it easier to recite poetry later on. So was this something that was forced upon you at some point?
Can I flip the question? Is that
Yeah.
okay? Marianne said that that poems were memorized earlier. Maybe Marianne would recite a poem for us. No? Okay. Just an
Well, I
idea.
could, but it's rather long, so
Give us a piece if you would. Let us hear some of your poetic voice, please.
um well, okay. One that I just love is Loveliest of Trees, the cherry now is hung with blooms along the bough. And I think of that every spring when I see cherry trees,
Yeah.
and it allows me to put into words emotions that are evoked by the visual. And it's somehow just combining the words with the visual and the emotions makes me feel whole.
Mhm.
So uh, I think, I think reciting poetry is just as easy as singing a song, but maybe other people feel differently.
I think
Thank you.
they're very similar. Yeah, that was beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think you answered your own question because you're carrying the poems with you still.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's beautiful to get them early and have them with us for different parts of our lives.
Yeah.
But I have one last question for you. Part of the reason, I mean, a big reason we're having this conversation is that Poetry Out Loud is at its 20th anniversary. And do you remember when Poetry Out Loud rolled out? And if so, do you remember what your first impressions were of it as a program? And how your just impressions of Poetry Out Loud as a program have changed over the years, if they have?
I assume this is a question for me. It's
Yeah,
20.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Lucky, if you remember when Poetry Out Loud launched 20 years ago, tell us all about it.
Yeah. My familiarity started when I moved to Washington. I came here from Tennessee, and I don't remember it being on my radar in Tennessee, but that might have just been my ignorance. But when I came to Washington, it seemed as if we have a pretty vibrant program, especially in the Methow Valley, kind of a dynamo of poetry. But I think that over the years that I've been in Washington, I started to notice more and more local competitors. I think Meade, or am I confusing Meade and Spokane? Spokane, East Valley, East Central had some competitors that made it to state. And I just started getting so excited to see that there was a formal way in which students were exposed to poetry and led to words, and not just through the classroom, but through a celebration of their ability to take words inside and share them with others. But it's something that came into my consciousness when I came to Washington State. So not to insult Tennessee.
Yeah, I can't go that far back, but I do remember going to the local, yeah, the regional competition that happens at the Merck and Twisp, um, for several years before I was old enough to partake in it. And I think I was always a little jealous and I was really excited to do it. I have a distinct memory of someone reciting a poem called They Are Hostile Nations by Margaret Atwood, which is kind of a warning about climate change. And I remember being very moved. And then there were also some kids who took a really humorous angle and made the whole audience laugh. So I definitely was exposed to it before I was able to participate in it, and it was kind of this like exciting milestone for making it to high school.
Well, thank you both. I want to thank both our speakers. Before we wrap, Alexis, would you remind everybody one more time where and when they can register for Poetry Out Loud?
You bet. You can go to the ArtsWA website, arts.wa.gov. There's a number of ways to get there. We are listed under the Arts and Education program. I'm going to put the link to the Poetry Out Loud registration page in the chat as soon as I get back to my Word document. The deadline to register for teachers and class with their classrooms and individuals is November 22nd, just before midnight. I'm also going to link our celebrating 20 years of Poetry Out Loud here in Washington State. And as Todd mentioned, yes, it was Meade High School. The winner of Meade High School went on to be our state champion in 2013, and then actually went on to be the national champion. So that is one of our state claims to fame, and that was Langston Ward from Meade High School.
Yeah, I've met Langston a couple of times. One kind of recommendation that I might give for parents is maybe as your child memorizes a poem, you could memorize a poem simultaneously, and I think that might be a wonderful thing to share, especially if there were different poems, and you could have the breaking of language over the table along with the breaking of bread.
Yeah, I
Wonderful.
see Someone says in the chat that they're gonna go to the public library and start reading poetry, which is so sweet. Last year for I know it's great to do both. Last year at Thanksgiving we had just a small two families together, and um, one of the things that our family friend said was everyone was going to bring something to read, and that was such a special little tradition, and I hope we do it again. I ended up reading a poem that I'd written, and other people brought poems that had meant a lot to them. So, yeah, as we go into the holiday season, that's a tradition that everyone could. It doesn't take a lot of time, and it's really special, and it just feels very warm and collective.
Thank you both. Everybody, let's give a big digital round of applause to our speakers. This was really phenomenal. The recording, we'll get this up on our YouTube channel, which I dropped that link into chat as soon as we can, maybe as soon as tomorrow, if I can get myself together, but watch for it in the days ahead for sure. Thank you both, Todd, Leki. It was really an honor to share space with you, and everybody who joined us online. Thank you for being here, and we hope to see you at a Poetry Out Loud event coming up very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Alexis, thank you for helping in the background. And have a good night, everybody. Get home safe.
Thank you.